A lot of people seem to think that Peter Thiel is a libertarian because he has described himself as that. But I mean, if you actually listen to a lot of the stuff he said and also look at the things he's done, he doesn't seem like a libertarian at all. I would make the distinction that if he is a libertarian, he's a cartel market libertarian as opposed to a free market libertarian. Peter Thiel does not like free markets. He does not like free market competition. He says competition is bad for profits and that you should corner a market and create a monopoly. And when he's done that and made monopolies, he's done it in conjunction with three-letter agencies in the US government. So this is not something that someone, a libertarian, quote unquote, does. I mean, he says, why shouldn't libertarians work with the government and enlarge the government and all of this? I mean, it honestly just makes very little sense, frankly. So I think, again, it's, using a word, using an identity, using a label to get people to identify with him, being like, oh, yeah, he's our guy. He's the libertarian billionaire in Silicon Valley and all of this.
Imagine someone sells you freedom. But behind the scenes, they are building the biggest surveillance machine you have ever seen. That is the uncomfortable story here. Because a lot of people look at Peter Thiel and think, this is the libertarian billionaire. This is the Silicon Valley rebel. This is the guy who backs Bitcoin, challenges the system, and wants government out of our lives. But then you look at what his companies actually helped build. PayPal became part of the digital payment world. Palantir became deeply connected to intelligence, surveillance, counterterrorism, policing, military operations, and Wall Street data systems. Facebook turned billions of people into voluntary data producers. Clearview AI scraped faces from the internet and turned public photos into law enforcement search tools. And suddenly you have to ask a very different question. Was this ever really about freedom? Or was freedom just the branding? Because the future being built here does not look like small government. It looks like private companies doing the things government used to do, but with better software, less visibility, and almost no democratic accountability. And the scariest part is that most people walked into this system willingly. We uploaded the photos, we shared the data, we used the apps, we trusted the platforms, we thought we were using technology, but maybe the technology was also using us. So before anyone tells you this is just innovation, ask yourself this. What happens when the same people who talk about freedom also control the payment rails, the surveillance tools, the facial recognition databases, the AI systems, and the politicians shaping the future? Because at that point, freedom may not disappear overnight. It may simply become a product, sold by the people building the cage.
You referenced earlier that speech at the Bitcoin conference a few years ago. Not only was he selling at the top, but also right after that, he went on a panel with then CIA director Mike Pompeo and was like, Bitcoin's probably a financial weapon from China to threaten the dollar. I mean, Peter Thiel is one of those guys that just, I think his public facing remarks are intentionally confusing. That way people can sort of point to, specific quotes and say, oh, he's this, oh, he's that. He's sort of like a public chameleon, I feel like, in that sense. A lot of people seem to think that Peter Thiel is a libertarian because he has described himself as that. But I mean, if you actually listen to a lot of the stuff he said and also look at the things he's done, he doesn't seem like a libertarian at all. I would make the distinction that if he is a libertarian, he's a cartel market libertarian as opposed to a free market libertarian. Peter Thiel does not like free markets. He does not like free market competition. He says competition is bad for profits and that you should corner a market and create a monopoly. And when he's done that and made monopolies, he's done it in conjunction with three-letter agencies in the US government. So this is not something that someone, a libertarian, quote unquote, does. I mean, he says, why shouldn't libertarians work with the government and enlarge the government and all of this? I mean, it honestly just makes very little sense, frankly. So I think, again, it's, using a word, using an identity, using a label to get people to identify with him, being like, oh, yeah, he's our guy. He's the libertarian billionaire in Silicon Valley and all of this. The co-founders, which, include Peter Thiel and Max Levchin and others, have been pretty open that as they were creating their business, they did so in consultation with pretty much every intelligence agency that would talk to them. And then PayPal, of course, has been partnered with intelligence on and off. in ways, in ways that are pretty significant as it relates to financial surveillance. And PayPal has also, well, of course, Peter Thiel hasn't been involved with it since the early 2000s or so. But then he went on to create Palantir, which he did so explicitly with the involvement of the CIA. For the first several years of its existence, Palantir's only client was the CIA. So the CIA was their first main funder alongside Thiel himself. It's really the deliberate resurrection by Thiel and Alex Karp of a failed DARPA public-private surveillance program called Total Information Awareness. And they went to the people that were running Total Information Awareness after it was shut down by Congress and basically tried to pick their brains about how to make a private-only version of this public-private partnership that was criticized by everyone, even in mainstream media, and pretty much every advocacy organization in the United States said this will eliminate privacy for every American, and it's blatantly unconstitutional. And so they just recreated it as a private sector entity. And now Palantir doesn't just do that for the U.S. government, they do it for Wall Street as well. Palantir doesn't just run the intelligence community, they also run Wall Street because, their AI and predictive analytics and all of that are used by some of the biggest firms in Wall Street, and they're also used by every single intelligence agency in the United States. So if you're a libertarian that wants to make government smaller and reduce the excesses and abuses of a government that's gotten out of control, why would you give the most out of control part of the government, the CIA, the most powerful and damaging to freedom weapon in its entire arsenal that's been used to profile Americans for the past 20 years based off of, all of the data we've freely put online, including on social networks like Facebook, which Peter Thiel it wouldn't exist without Peter Thiel. Yes, it's Mark Zuckerberg made it and whatever, but the person that made it what it is was Peter Thiel, because he was the first big outside investor.
Oh, wow.
And the jump from being this little goofy thing on a couple college campuses to being a global social network. And he only left the board relatively recently, a few years ago. So,
oh my gosh.
And another Thiel funded company, Clearview AI, scraped all of the pictures for its facial recognition database off of Facebook, which again, Facebook was also a resurrection of a DARPA program related to total information awareness called LifeLog, by the way. And so basically, Peter Thiel was privatizing all of these very controversial surveillance programs for the intelligence community. And again, Clearview AI took all of our faces off of Facebook that we freely shared.
Oh my God.
And used it to create a facial recognition database that law enforcement has. And in their sales pitch, they brag about identifying people that were at the Capitol on January 6, 2021, Trump supporters, and passing it all to law enforcement. And now the person probably closest to Peter Thiel in the world, besides people like Sam Altman, is JD Vance, Trump's vice presidential candidate.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about, because essentially Peter Thiel contributed to his career, right?
Well, and also his venture capital career, which started at Mithril Capital, and then Peter Thiel was one of the main people that financed his JD Vance's own venture capital firm, Narya Capital, and then bankrolled his initial Senate run, and
wow.
Yeah, he's essentially a Thiel-made man.
So, after listening to all of this, here is the part that should really stay with you. This story is not just about Peter Thiel. It is not just about Palantir. It is not just about Bitcoin, Facebook, Clearview AI, JD Vance, or Silicon Valley politics. It is about a much bigger pattern. A pattern where the language of freedom is used to build systems of control. And once you see that pattern, it becomes very hard to unsee. Because for years, people were sold this beautiful story about technology. The internet would free us. Social media would connect us. Digital payments would empower us. Crypto would liberate us from banks. AI would make life easier. And every time, the promise sounded amazing. But then the same thing kept happening. The tools that were sold as liberation became systems of extraction. The platforms that promised connection became data farms. The companies that promised innovation became monopolies. The apps that felt harmless became behavioral tracking machines. And the people who said they were fighting centralized power often ended up building even more powerful forms of centralized control. That is the contradiction Whitney Webb is pointing to. If someone calls himself a libertarian, but builds companies closely tied to intelligence agencies, government contracts, predictive analytics, financial surveillance, facial recognition, and political influence, then the label starts to matter less than the structure. Because freedom is not what someone calls himself. Freedom is what the system actually allows you to keep. Can you keep your privacy? Can you keep your financial independence? Can you speak without being profiled? Can you move without being tracked? Can you participate in society without feeding your face, your behavior, your purchases, your opinions, and your relationships into someone else's database? That is the real question. And this is where Palantir becomes so important. Because Palantir is not just a normal tech company. It sits at the intersection of data, intelligence, war, policing, finance, and artificial intelligence. That does not automatically mean everything it does is illegal or evil, but it does mean we should be paying very close attention. Because when a company builds tools that help institutions see patterns across massive amounts of data, that power can be used in many ways. It can be used to stop threats. It can be used to solve crimes. It can be used to manage logistics. But it can also be used to profile people, predict people, target people, exclude people. And once those systems are built, they rarely stay limited to the original purpose. That is the oldest trick in modern security. A system is created for terrorism, then it moves to crime, then it moves to immigration, then it moves to protests, then it moves to finance, then it moves to ordinary citizens. And by the time people realize how wide the net has become, the system is already normal. That is why the private sector angle matters so much. When government builds a surveillance program, at least people know where to look. You can criticize the agency, you can demand oversight, you can ask elected officials questions. But when surveillance is outsourced into private companies, everything becomes harder to see. It becomes contracts, it becomes software, it becomes classified partnerships, it becomes proprietary systems, it becomes, sorry, we cannot discuss that for security reasons. And that is how democratic accountability starts disappearing behind a login screen. The scariest part is that we helped build the raw material ourselves. We posted the photos, we uploaded the faces, we shared the locations, we liked the posts, we linked the contacts, we made the networks. We gave the machine the training data. Honestly, if the surveillance state had knocked on the door 20 years ago and said, please hand us your face, your friends, your opinions, your habits, your politics, your shopping behavior, and your emotional reactions, most people would have said, absolutely not. But put it inside a fun app with birthday reminders and vacation photos, and suddenly everyone joins. That is the genius of the system. It does not always need force. Sometimes it just needs convenience. And that brings us to the political side. Because once these tech networks start producing politicians, funding campaigns, shaping policy, and staffing government with people who believe in their worldview, the issue becomes much bigger than one company. Now we are talking about a new ruling model. Not old school government, not pure free markets, but a fusion. Private companies with state power, billionaires with political influence, AI systems with government contracts, surveillance tools with national security branding, and citizens who are told this is all just efficiency. But efficiency for whom?